Life is a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. My name is Matthew Carter, and this is the story of how my brother's house was ripped away from him while he was serving his country overseas, and how I made sure those responsible paid the price. My brother, Logan Carter, had always been the kind of person who stepped up when others hesitated. As a kid, he would carry groceries for the elderly, mow lawns without expecting payment, and believed in helping his community no matter what. That same sense of duty led him straight into the military, where he quickly rose through the ranks, earning commendations for his dedication and service. Despite the dangers, he never once complained about his deployments. He saw his fellow soldiers as family, bound together by experiences most could never understand. Eventually, after years of careful saving and planning, Logan bought himself a modest two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a cozy living room. But to him, it was everything. A symbol of stability, a piece of home. I still remember the excitement in his voice the day he called me, standing on his new porch with the keys in hand, calling it our place, even though I didn't live there. That was Logan, always generous, always thinking of others. Before his next deployment, he ensured everything was in order. His mortgage was set to auto-pay, his bills were covered, and he gave me power of attorney just in case anything needed handling in his absence. We both assumed everything would be smooth sailing. But life doesn't always work that way. The nightmare began with a phone call from our mother. It was early evening, and I had just gotten off work, sitting in my car, scrolling through messages when the phone rang. Her voice was trembling, something I had rarely heard before. Matthew, they sold Logan's house. My heart slammed against my ribcage. What do you mean, they sold his house? The words barely formed as my throat tightened, dread creeping in. The HOA, she whispered, her voice hollow. They put it up for auction. At that moment, I didn't even know how to react. My mother wasn't someone who panicked easily, so if she was scared, it meant the situation was dire. Without wasting another second, I gripped my keys and drove straight to Logan's house, my mind racing with questions. How could a fully paid mortgage, with no missed payments, be sold? It had to be a mistake, a clerical error. There was no other explanation. But as I turned onto Logan Street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. A moving truck sat in the driveway, its back panel rolled up, revealing Logan's belongings being hauled out like discarded junk. His couch, his TV, the wooden shelf where he displayed his military plaques. All of it being handled by strangers with no regard for the memories attached. My stomach churned with rage. I parked behind the truck and stormed out, barely able to keep my composure. And then I saw her, Samantha Turner, the HOA president. She stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the moving crew like she was orchestrating some grand production. I had met her once before. Logan had mentioned her in passing, complaining about her nitpicking ways. She was the kind of person who left aggressive notes about trash bins being an inch out of place and seemed to thrive on controlling the neighborhood. But never in my wildest dreams did I think she would be capable of something like this. Samantha Turner turned around slowly, a smirk forming on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of expression that made my blood boil, the smug confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. "Mr. Carter, I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What the hell is going on here?" My voice shook, not from fear, but from the sheer rage bubbling beneath the surface. Samantha let out a dramatic sigh, flipping through the pages on her clipboard with exaggerated slowness. "This property was auctioned off last week due to unpaid HOA fees," she said, feigning boredom. The words didn't make sense. Unpaid HOA fees? Logan was meticulous with his bills, especially anything tied to his house. He had everything automated to avoid even the slightest issue. "That's impossible," I shot back, my voice firm. "My brother is deployed overseas, and his mortgage is paid automatically. He doesn't owe you anything." Samantha arched an eyebrow, as if I were merely amusing her with my protest. "Actually," she said, dragging the word out, He violated HOA policy by leaving the house unoccupied for over 6 months without filing the required absence paperwork. That's considered abandonment under our rules. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the absurdity of what I had just heard. Abandonment? I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. He's not some deadbeat who skipped town. He's serving his country. But Samantha only shrugged, her smirk widening. The law is the law, she said coldly, as if those words excused the sheer cruelty of what she had done. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned to the police officer standing nearby. You're just going to let this happen? I demanded, my voice raw with disbelief. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. It's a civil matter, sir. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it to court. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a calculated move, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They had found a loophole, exploited it, and were now trying to act as if they had done nothing wrong. And the worst part? They were confident they'd get away with it. I had no choice but to walk away that day, but I wasn't giving up, not by a long shot. I went home, my mind spinning with everything I had just witnessed. The moment I walked through my door, I threw myself into research. I spread out Logan's mortgage documents, bank statements, and HOA letters across my dining table, determined to find any flaw in their reasoning. My brother had done everything right, yet his home had still been taken from him. And that's when I noticed something strange. Hidden in the fine print of the HOA's bylaws were repeated fines for things that made no sense. They had claimed Logan's lawn was neglected, despite him having a landscaping service. They had fined him for having a security camera, even though half the neighborhood had the exact same system installed. These fines weren't just excessive, they were targeted. I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through every possible way to fight back against the HOA. This wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. This was about exposing the corruption that had allowed this to happen in the first place. By morning, I had already started making calls. First, I contacted the mortgage company, confirming that Logan's payments had been up to date with no missed transactions. Then, I dug into the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a federal law designed to protect deployed military personnel from exactly this kind of situation. What I found made my blood boil. Under the law, an active-duty service member's property could not be foreclosed upon or sold without extensive legal procedures, including a requirement to notify both the service member and their mortgage lender. The HOA had ignored these protections entirely, acting as if they had absolute power over Logan's home. But the worst discovery was yet to come. The so-called auction that had taken place was nothing more than a sham. The buyer? None other than Samantha Turner's cousin. The house had been sold at a fraction of its value, a clear case of insider dealing. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time event. This was a system they had perfected over time. They targeted homeowners who were away for long periods, imposed fabricated fines, and forced foreclosures, all to seize properties and resell them at rock-bottom prices to their own connections. It was a textbook case of fraud. That's when I knew I needed professional help. I spent the next few hours calling lawyers, explaining the situation. Most of them sympathized, but many told me this would be a long and expensive battle. Some outright refused to take on an HOA, warning that these cases often got tied up in bureaucracy. I was starting to lose hope until a friend referred me to an attorney named Adrian Callahan, a man known for taking on corrupt HOAs and winning. His office was in a modest building, cluttered with legal books, case files, and coffee cups, and his reputation was that of a bulldog, relentless and fearless. The moment I stepped into his office and laid out the case, he didn't hesitate. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming as he tapped his pen against his desk. "This isn't just bad," he said, "this is illegal as hell." Those words were all I needed to hear. He immediately started drafting an emergency injunction to freeze the sale of Logan's house, preventing any further transfers of ownership. This was the first step in dismantling the HOA scam. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal action. If the law moved too slowly, I was going to make sure this story reached as many people as possible. That's when I turned to the media, reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets. If Samantha and her corrupt board thought they could get away with this quietly, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The moment Adrian filed the emergency injunction, I wasted no time taking the fight to the next level. If the legal process was going to take time, then I would make sure the entire world knew what this HOA had done. I started reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets, detailing how a homeowners association had illegally auctioned off the house of a deployed soldier. At first, a few small outlets picked up the story, but it didn't take long before the outrage started spreading. Military families across the country were furious, and social media exploded with people demanding justice. Headlines began appearing, each one more damning than the last, exposing how Logan's home had been stolen under a fraudulent loophole, all while he was overseas defending the very freedoms these HOA members took for granted. Samantha Turner and her board were about to face the kind of scrutiny they never expected. Meanwhile, Adrian was already preparing for the next step. He filed for a lawsuit citing violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, fraud, and illegal foreclosure. The evidence against the HOA was overwhelming. Not only had they failed to notify Logan or his mortgage lender, but they had also engaged in what could only be described as a predatory scheme to steal homes under false pretenses. The judge granted a temporary freeze on any ownership changes, meaning Logan's house couldn't be sold again or modified while the case was ongoing. That was a small victory, but I wanted more. I wanted them exposed. I decided to personally deliver the court order to the HOA office. Walking into their headquarters, I felt a rush of satisfaction as I slammed the legal documents onto Samantha's desk. She barely looked up, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. "See you in court," I muttered, keeping my voice steady. Samantha didn't say a word, just tightened her grip on her pen and glanced at the papers. But I wasn't done yet. If they thought they could handle this quietly, they were in for a rude awakening. I started contacting every major news station, military forums, and social media pages that focused on veterans' rights. Within days, the story had gone viral. It wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about every deployed service member who could be at risk of losing their home to a corrupt HOA. The pressure was mounting, and Samantha's smug attitude started to crack. Neighbors began questioning what else the HOA had done behind closed doors. Reports started surfacing about similar cases, where homeowners had been unfairly fined, threatened with foreclosure, and even forced out under shady legal loopholes. The dominoes were falling fast. The court date was set, and as the pressure continued to rise, it was clear that Samantha and her HOA board were running out of ways to escape the truth. As the court date approached, the weight of the case started pressing down on the HOA. What they had assumed would be a quiet, uncontested foreclosure had turned into a nationwide scandal. The more the media covered it, the worse it got for them. Military families, veterans, and even active duty personnel flooded social media with their outrage, demanding accountability. Some even dug into the HOA's past, uncovering that this wasn't the first time they had used questionable tactics against homeowners. Their reputation was crumbling, and Samantha Turner could no longer ignore the storm heading her way. Adrian and I spent countless hours compiling every piece of evidence, making sure that when we entered that courtroom, there would be no way for them to twist the facts. We had mortgage statements proving Logan had never missed a payment, deployment orders showing he was protected under federal law, and documentation revealing how the HOA had manipulated the system to declare his house abandoned. But that wasn't all. Witness testimonies started coming in. Neighbors who had seen the moving truck that day, people who had been pressured by the HOA, and even former board members who admitted that Samantha had been using her position to push through illegal sales. The case wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof. Then came the unexpected twist. A day before the trial, an anonymous tip landed in Adrian's inbox. An email thread between Samantha and other board members, explicitly detailing how they planned to exploit homeowners who couldn't fight back. The messages were damning. In one, Samantha arrogantly boasted about how easy it was to take over properties when the owners were absent, stating that they'll never see it coming. Another message confirmed that Logan's case had been planned well in advance, with a deliberate strategy to rush the auction before anyone could intervene. This was the final nail in their coffin. With this new evidence, Adrian pushed for an even stronger case, adding further charges of fraudulent intent. The night before the trial, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice spoke on the other end. It was Samantha Turner. Gone was her usual smug tone. Instead, she sounded panicked, desperate. She tried to negotiate, suggesting a quiet settlement to resolve things without dragging it out. I didn't even let her finish. There was nothing to discuss. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about justice. "See you in court," I said before hanging up. The next morning, as I walked into the courthouse, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what tricks they had left, they were about to face the consequences of their corruption. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, military families, neighbors, and even people who had been following the case online. Samantha Turner sat on the other side of the room, flanked by her attorney and a few other HOA board members. But the confidence she once carried was gone. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge wasted no time, immediately addressing the case and acknowledging the overwhelming public interest in the trial. Adrian stood up first, presenting the facts with precision. He laid out the clear violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, showing how Logan had been unlawfully targeted, how the HOA had completely ignored federal protections, and how the so-called auction was a fraudulent transaction benefiting Samantha's cousin. As each point was laid out, the judge's expression grew more serious. The evidence spoke for itself. Mortgage statements confirming Logan had never missed a payment, HOA records showing fabricated violations, and the newly discovered emails proving the entire scheme had been orchestrated deliberately. When it was time for the HOA's lawyer to respond, they tried to argue that they had followed state guidelines regarding abandoned properties, claiming they had no knowledge of Logan's military status. But Adrian was prepared. He presented emails between Logan and the HOA that explicitly mentioned his deployment, making it clear they had been fully aware. Then, he revealed the biggest blow of the case, the internal HOA emails that showed their deliberate plan to seize Logan's home. The courtroom went silent. Samantha's lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, reading through the emails himself, and then turned to Samantha directly. His voice was firm, cutting through the tense silence. The HOA had not only broken the law, but had done so with full knowledge of their actions, making this more than just negligence. It was fraud. Samantha's face was pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if trying to hold herself together. The HOA board members beside her looked equally panicked, some whispering to each other in hushed tones. Then came the judge's ruling. The foreclosure and sale of Logan's home were declared null and void, restoring full ownership to him immediately. But that wasn't all. The judge also ordered a full investigation into the HOA's practices, stating that this case alone was enough to warrant legal action against multiple individuals involved. The courtroom erupted, murmurs spreading through the audience as reporters rushed to document the verdict. Samantha and her lawyer tried to argue, but the judge wasn't interested in hearing any excuses. There would be no settlement, no quiet resolution. The HOA had played a dangerous game, and now they were paying the price. As I turned to look at Samantha one last time, I saw the reality of her downfall settling in. She had built her power on fear and control, but in the end, justice had caught up to her. The moment the gavel hit the desk, sealing the verdict, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. Logan's home was safe, and the people who had tried to steal it were about to face the full force of the law. But even as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew this wasn't just a personal victory. This was a message to every corrupt HOA out there that they weren't untouchable anymore. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but I knew this wasn't the end. The ruling had been a massive victory, but the fight wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. The judge's order for a full investigation meant that the entire HOA board was now under scrutiny, and as the legal process unfolded, the truth about their corruption was coming to light. Reporters wasted no time in digging deeper, uncovering that Logan wasn't the only victim. Over the years, Samantha and her board had targeted multiple homeowners, forcing them into foreclosure through fabricated fines and technicalities. People who had been too exhausted, financially drained, or unaware of their rights had lost their homes, and now, for the first time, they were coming forward. Lawsuits were being filed left and right, homeowners demanding justice, and Samantha Turner, once the untouchable ruler of the HOA, was now facing legal action that went far beyond our case. Adrian and I watched as the walls closed in around them. HOA board members started resigning, some trying to distance themselves from the scandal, while others outright admitted they had been part of the scheme, hoping for leniency in court. But the evidence was too strong. The fraudulent auction of Logan's home had been the tipping point, and now the entire operation was collapsing. Meanwhile, Logan, still overseas, was finally able to catch up on everything that had happened. When I spoke to him on the phone, there was a long silence as he processed it all. He had expected to return to a quiet home, but instead, he was coming back to a story that had shaken the entire community. But more than anything, he was grateful that people had stood up for him, that justice had prevailed, and that he still had a home waiting for him. As the legal battle continued, the fallout spread beyond just our case. Local lawmakers began pushing for changes in HOA regulations, demanding stricter oversight and better protection for homeowners, especially military personnel. What had started as a personal fight had turned into something much bigger, and the thought of it made me realize just how many people had suffered under the unchecked power of corrupt HOAs. The public pressure on Samantha and her associates was relentless. Their assets were frozen, their powers stripped away, and they were now facing a court battle that would likely end in criminal charges. The smug, arrogant Samantha had once displayed was gone, replaced with desperation as she tried to navigate the consequences of her actions. But there was no way out. The damage she had done was irreversible, and for once, she was the one with no control over the situation. The neighborhood itself had changed too. The HOA, now under temporary management, was being restructured, and the fear that had once gripped homeowners had disappeared. People spoke freely, openly questioning policies that had gone unchallenged for years. The community had come together in a way no one had expected, and as I looked around, I realized that this fight had done more than just expose corruption. It had given people back their voice. But there was still one final moment left in this battle, the one that mattered the most. Logan was coming home, and this time, he wouldn't be walking into a stolen house or a broken neighborhood. He would be coming back to a community that had fought for him, and that was a victory far greater than anything I had imagined. The day Logan returned home was unlike anything I had ever seen. As I drove to the airport, I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months. This had started as a desperate fight to save his home, but it had turned into something far bigger, a movement that exposed corruption and forced change. When I pulled up to the arrival section, I spotted Logan immediately. He looked exhausted but relieved, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he scanned the crowd. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted from uncertainty to a familiar grin, the same one he had when we were kids and had just pulled off some ridiculous prank. I stepped out of the car, and before I could say a word, he pulled me into a hug, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened. As we drove back, I tried to explain everything: the court battle, the media firestorm, the sheer number of people who had rallied behind him. Logan listened quietly, his gaze fixed outside the window, taking in the neighborhood he had nearly lost. When we finally turned onto his street, he let out a sharp breath. The driveway was filled with neighbors, friends, and even people he didn't know, all gathered to welcome him home. Flags waved, homemade signs covered the lawn, and a banner stretched across his porch with the words, "Welcome home, Logan." I glanced at him, half expecting him to be overwhelmed, but instead, he just shook his head in disbelief. He stepped out of the car, and within seconds, people surrounded him, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back, thanking him for his service. Some of the veterans in the neighborhood stood off to the side, offering silent salutes, a gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. As Logan made his way through the crowd, he stopped at the porch, running a hand over the railing as if confirming it was real. He turned to me, his voice low but steady, asking if everything was really over. I nodded, telling him that his house was safe, that the HOA was in shambles, and that Samantha Turner was facing legal consequences for everything she had done. For the first time since he had landed, I saw him truly relax. He took a deep breath, stepping inside his home, his fingers brushing against the doorframe. I followed him in, watching as he walked through each room, taking it all in. The furniture had been rearranged, the walls repainted, but it was still his home. The sense of loss that had once lingered was gone, replaced with something stronger: justice, victory, and the undeniable truth that he had won. That night, we sat on the porch as the last of the neighbors left, the air filled with the distant hum of cicadas. Logan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he muttered that he never expected to come home to a full-blown legal war. I laughed, shaking my head, telling him that he owed me for the stress. He smirked, saying he would make it up to me someday. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite the months of chaos, corruption, and uncertainty, we had won. Not just against the HOA, not just for Logan's house, but for every person who had ever been wronged by people who thought they were above the law. The battle was over, but the impact of what we had done would last forever. The weeks following Logan's return felt surreal. The HOA, once a feared entity in the neighborhood, had collapsed under the weight of its corruption. Samantha Turner, once untouchable, was now facing multiple lawsuits and potential criminal charges. The rest of the HOA board had either resigned or disappeared, trying to avoid the fallout, but it was too late. The state had stepped in, launching an official investigation into not just our case, but every foreclosure the HOA had processed in the past 5 years. More homeowners came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and sudden foreclosures that had forced them from their homes. Logan's case had set off a chain reaction, and the legal system was finally holding these people accountable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had transformed. The fear that had once loomed over homeowners was gone, replaced with a newfound sense of unity. A new HOA was formed, this time led by residents who valued transparency and fairness. Monthly meetings were held where people could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up were now actively involved, ensuring that nothing like this could ever happen again. But for Logan, the real victory wasn't just getting his house back. It was the overwhelming support he had received from people all over the country. Veterans, active duty soldiers, and even complete strangers had reached out, sharing their outrage and standing with him through it all. He had gone from being a victim of a corrupt system to a symbol of resilience, and though he never sought the attention, he appreciated knowing that his story had made a difference. As for Samantha, the last we heard, she had left town, her reputation in ruins. No matter where she went, the internet had made sure that her name would always be associated with one of the most egregious HOA scandals in history. She had built her career on control and power, but in the end, both had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing. Logan and I never spoke about her much after that. She wasn't worth the energy. Instead, we focused on moving forward. Logan took some time off to settle back into civilian life, reconnecting with old friends and spending time with our mother, who had been waiting anxiously for him to come home. As for me, the entire experience had changed something inside me. I had fought for Logan, but in the process, I had learned just how many people had suffered in silence, powerless against the corruption of HOAs that had too much unchecked authority. I started looking into advocacy work, connecting with organizations that help military families fight legal battles just like the one we had won. Adrian, ever the bulldog, encouraged me to take it seriously, saying I had a knack for exposing fraud and injustice. I wasn't sure where it would lead me, but I knew one thing: I was never going to let something like this happen to anyone else without a fight. One evening, as Logan and I sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood he had nearly lost, he turned to me and smirked, saying that if I ever needed a place to crash, his door was always open. I laughed, shaking my head, realizing that despite everything, some things never changed. Logan was home, justice had been served, And for the first time in a long time, the world felt right again.